Welcome to The Voice of Counseling, presented by the American Counseling Association. This program is hosted by Dr. S. Kent Butler. This week's episode is celebrating 100 years of the Journal of Counseling and Development and features Dr. Matthew Lemberger-Truelove.
Welcome to The Voice of Counseling from the American Counseling Association. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler, and joining us today is Dr. Matthew Lemberger-Truelove. Matthew is a professor in the counselor education program at the University of North Texas. He is also the editor of the Journal of Counseling and Development and a past editor of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling. Dr. Lemberger-Truelove's scholarly work includes empirical research, funded projects, and theoretical writing. His empirical work generally focuses on interventions that include social, emotional learning, and mindfulness. He is especially interested in culturally responsive interventions that support children and families from challenging economic environments. His interventions work was highlighted in an extremely competitive and noteworthy Castle Guide. Dr. Lemberger-Truelove's theoretical work generally pertains to humanistic counseling and social justice ideologies. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Matthew Lemberger-Truelove. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Ken. Thanks for having me. I was thinking of, as a part of that introduction, I should have noted that you and I have known each other for over 20 years. We used to work together at UMSL, and I think that this is
Yeah, University of Missouri, St. Louis. You came in as a new doc, completed dissertation guy, and hit the ground running right from the start. School counseling background.
That's right. Yeah, you too. And so here we are now, all these years later, 2 decades later.
All these years later. So what was the push towards school counseling for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll kind of give you the brief version of the whole potted history, but there's a personal side and then there's a professional side. The personal side, like so many of us in our field, comes from my own childhood. My parents, my mother was a maid, grew up in a multi-ethnic, coming from the reservations of Wisconsin down to Kansas City, where she met my father, who was a musician who left school very young, and they struggled economically throughout the entirety of their young adult and later adult lives. And while I always did really well in school, I did always wonder from a very young age, in what ways did the social challenges related to their background, their parenting practices, the neighborhood that we grew up in, how did that affect my own performance in school, and how did it affect my social relationships and so on and so forth. And so that was always kind of there as a prior determinant of kind of what would influence all my choices. And so then I went to undergrad, first person in my family and really my neighborhood in many ways to pursue higher education. And so I didn't really have this background of knowing, how to navigate that, or how that linked into a different life after graduation. I just was always told, if you wanted something different than the circumstances you were in, you go to college, right? And so and in so doing, I picked up multiple majors because they were like these new vistas of knowledge that I just hadn't had exposure to. And so rather than, like a lot of folks changing majors, I just kept adding new ones. And so I knew I wanted to do something in the helping professions. I took my first class at a liberal arts college, and we had to take a philosophy course and fell in love with it. So I said, okay, that's going to be a major. Psychology, because of this kind of emerging interest in helping folks, seemed like a logical, very practical choice. And then also education, because for me, education to that point had been so influential in making different trajectories than what my family had, my parents. And so it wasn't until, towards the end, I had some of my philosophy professors say, you should be going to philosophy PhD programs. And my favorite courses in psychology were like the sensation and perception and the cognition courses. And there was this kind of nascent field of neuropsychology. And I had those professors telling me I should go into doctoral programs there. And none of those really felt like they they were complementary to my heart place of wanting to help people, but
Right.
there was still something important and influential about those exposures.
Right.
And so I took a graduate class in the philosophy of education, where we read John Dewey's Democracy in Education, Vygotsky's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, some Vygotsky. And I thought, who could embody this in praxis? Whether it be the things in the emerging field of neuroscience, the kind of influence of philosophy, perennial philosophy, and how people make the good life, and then these ideas from these luminaries in the early, who were the early thinkers in formal education. And I thought, this was school counselors. Even though my school counselors didn't necessarily do this, there was a potential, like the bones of the profession were there. And so I kind of used the old school approach and looked in the field and said, I'm going to choose a graduate program based upon not geographic, proximity, but instead, like, who's doing the work that I think most closely reflects these interests. And so I looked up, there was an intervention study done by Greg Brigman, which was one of the kind of the early studies of what is the now popularized student success skills program. And so I went down to study with him, and he's been a lifelong mentor. In fact, we were talking on the phone last night for many hours. He's much of a paternal figure, but that really set the tone for what would be my career interest all the way up to this point in this day and age. And so, from there, I
named the person.
high school. Go ahead.
Did you name the mentor?
Yeah, Greg Brigman. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Greg and
I could see the philosophy thread that runs through your life.
Yeah.
Just in our personal and professional relationship, I can see how that interweaves in terms of who you are as an individual. So I can see why you chose to continue to kind of have that as kind of the, I guess, the underpinnings of who you are as a counselor. Can you talk a little bit about how that then transitioned into you becoming a scholar, and you then also becoming now the journal editors of two phenomenal journals put through by ACA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, humanism is complex, but really, counseling as a discrete profession from psychology and social work and the other helping professions, of course, we share so many different things even to this day, whether it be, even our publication manuals, but then also legislation and practice. But theoretically, where they differentiated was the influence of humanism. And so, like, there was this kind of complex influence on me, because on the one hand, whether it was neuroscience or looking at social justice issues, the social determinants of a person's life were so clear to me, and yet it didn't fully encapsulate, fully describe what it meant to be a person for me. And so I was very much interested in existentialism and how we make personal meaning, and how personal meaning in some way interfaces with those prior determinants of experience. And so as a consequence of that, it got me engaged in the Association for Humanistic Counseling, which was one of our original divisions in ACA, which then led to being a member of the review board, and then promoted to an associate editor, and then after that becoming an editor for like 7 years, I believe, for JHC, which I loved greatly. And
I must add, at a very, very early stage of your career, that you took on these responsibilities, because you ain't been around that long.
Well, it has been now, right? But at the time, you're right. I was just transitioning from assistant to associate professor when I took on JHC. So I was probably only 5 or 6 years into the field. So, I was only associate editor for like a year and a half when I made the transition to editor. And then, like I said, there was 7 years as editor of JHC, and then now the last 3.5 with JCD.
JCD, yeah. And so one of the things that I think that we jokingly talk about a little bit is your verbose or your ability to kind of utilize words. You're a linguist to me. When I think of different word choices that you use, and it just so fits the philosophy side of you. with regards to that. Can you talk a little bit about your development there? Because you often talk about when you grew up, what you had and what you didn't have. And, though you had a love of education and you were moving forward, you didn't have the means and you didn't know sometimes where you were going to be moving forward to, even though you thought college was in your future. Can you talk about how words started to matter to you?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, part of the history that I've kind of neglected is that kind of in the midpoint, right there around the transition from childhood to adolescence, I actually had a very violent experience happen at a park. And, in my family system, the typical response to any circumstance was anger. And yet that morning after, I was really sad. And I don't know if it was like, the unique conditions of that moment or some type of serendipity or whatever it might be, but I decided to pay attention to my thoughts and my feelings, and even as a prepubescent individual. And I did look around and said, like, what is this experience? And I wanted something different. And so that's when I got into meditating at 14 years old. And as a consequence of that, and this was before the popularization of mindfulness. Mindfulness at that time was this, again, kind of nascent emergent thing. And I got into it, and it was just very clear that the paucity of Western writing related to mindfulness also pertained to behaviorism and the construction of our thoughts and the words, and how language was basically like the software of our mind, right? And so, it certainly wasn't as sophisticated as an early teen, and given some of the opportunities that I had in my family and my school environments, but whatever things I could get a hold of at that time, I used to teach myself. And so language became something that wasn't just consequential. It became something that I wanted to make very intentional in my life.
Okay.
And and maybe we'll talk about this later, because I think that's also true for how I position myself as a counselor, especially working with kids, and especially working with kids who oftentimes are in very challenging situations. The choice of language, without presupposing people's prior exposures and their proclivities and preferences, but it's still nonetheless very important to have a match with circumstance. And so, for me, yeah, language, again, it's like that software that drives our decisions. And so rather than reacting, we can respond to circumstances. So yeah, so I very much appreciate that.
It's also a very endearing part of you, because your students really appreciate you challenging them in those ways, right? I remember you grading papers, and your word choices for students in terms of how they grow and they develop in their writing was very spot on in terms of helping them to see the difference. Because I remember one student coming up to you or coming up to me and asking me, what does this word mean right here that Dr. Lemberger has put on my paper, right? And but it taught them to kind of figure it out. If you don't know something, then you need to go and figure it out.
Yeah, and also to be very intentional about our language. I often ask my students, think about a thought before it occurs, right? Because, so oftentimes, or even now in conversation, like, I don't know the words that I'm going to say until after I say them, right? I'm observing the experience. And so therefore there are social determinants. And, later you and I, because of our shared interests, we'll probably talk about social justice, but those social influences are so incredibly impactful that they dictate even how we present ourselves to the world. And so, and sometimes using this vocabulary in settings like this, or like in teaching, might be a bit more dense, because I do want to not just challenge the students up. It's not just, verbosity for the sake of, like to be a charlatan, but instead it does challenge people to pause and think, like, what does this language mean and how does it connect with other individuals? Whereas just kind of everyday colloquial language, we take it for granted. It's very disposable. And so, and obviously with kids, it's very different, right? We would use more emotively charged language rather than something that's kind of like polysymbolic or something like that. So, but yeah, I mean, it is intentional, but with intentions to connect in ways that makes us more pensive, more reflective, and more aware, so we can hopefully make decisions moving into the forward that is more befitting of our intentions and our hopes and aspirations.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you from a personal point of view, you kept me on my toes. You definitely did.
Mission
So,
accomplished, right? I'm glad to know that that's true.
yeah. I don't think I've ever said that to you, but we've kind of talked about it. So how does that translate then in terms of how you see yourself as a father, because you have 2 children? How does language matter there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, language is everything. We learn language through imitation and replication, right? And so with Nara, my oldest, and with Adam, going back to my mentor, like there's bits of language that we try to script, but then also allowing them to internalize it and express it in their own unique ways. And so like from my great mentor, in the student success skills program, don't doubt your ability to try a different strategy. Nara and I say that every day, right? But I allow her to play with what it means to her so that it becomes personalized.
So the school counselor in you,
Yeah,
you talked about the social justice aspect of it all. You from the very beginning, when I knew you, you had a very strong social justice component to how you saw counseling. You got your degree from the University of South Carolina.
yeah.
Is that where you got your master's as well? I'm not sure I remember where you got your master's.
It was down in Florida Atlantic to study with Greg Brigman in particular.
That's right. That's right.
Didn't have a
That's
doctoral
right.
program at the time, so yeah.
That's right. That's right. So your connection was Florida. Then I remember when I left Missouri and went to Florida, you're like, you're going back into where I came from, type of a situation. So you became a school counselor and started teaching in that realm when you got to the University of Missouri St. Louis. What were your students gravitated to you so quickly when you got there? A lot of it was your youth, but the other part of it was just that you were an imposing figure in terms of school counseling, because you knew what you wanted to share. Yeah. And you knew what students needed to do. Can you talk a little bit about what that drive was as a new professor? What was it about the students at University of Missouri St. Louis that made you kind of go into your teaching style in a way that they were able to accept, I guess, because Missouri was a totally different animal?
Yeah. I think the first thing, and we could talk, something that also influences my practice is the idea of the common factors, like across different theoretical orientations, there's certain qualities, and engendering hope is one of which. And I think that's true for clients. I think it's true for students, like that there is something that you can garner for your efforts with, if you pursue it with passion. So I think that is one thing. I think the other thing is, like, I am radically tied to school counseling. I'm also guessing that later we might talk about like what I think is, some distinguishing factors about counseling. And I go to that Myers 1992 piece, if I'm remembering correctly, of prevention, development, and wellness. And school counseling, just by its very nature, is preventative. It's developmental over the course of many years. And then it's focused on the cultivation of internal capacities. And so then tethering that to social justice, you can't help a child develop if you're not also working in reciprocity with the environments. Regardless of how powerful the intervention might be, that if the environments don't in some way elicit, reinforce, and celebrate any changes in the way that you have cultivated these new skills in kids, that it will soon taper away. Like, those other experiences will be an adverse effect on those positive experiences from counseling. So I think, being very passionate about this idea, and then also showing how sophisticated the work in schools are, but yet in a very approachable, palpable way.
And you did that by modeling too. So you told the students that they need to be out in the communities.
Told them.
And you were in the communities. You were showing them through your example how to make that work. Your research was helping to showcase that as well.
Yeah. I mean, school counseling research, less than, I think it's Kat Griffin and a couple of other authors did a piece last year, maybe 2 years ago now, less than 1%, I think it's point one, not 0.01, of the publications in the total literature across all the counseling journals is school counseling intervention pieces. And so of those, if what they're telling me is true, a critical number of those, like almost 20% of those are studies that we've done with my students over the years.
Yeah. So when you so that's a good way to kind of think about it. How do we take it out of the journals and make it more practical? How do we make sure that people don't just read it and say, "Oh yeah, this is a nice stat," but actually do the work? That's the social justice piece. How do we get people to then take that example and utilize it in their communities?
That's right. Well, I mean, first of all, we have to be honest with ourselves. So I described the numbers with school counseling, and it's a bit different when we talk about the other subspecialties, but it's not that different. D. Ray, one of my colleagues here at North Texas in 2011, I believe, did a piece, and only 6% of the counseling published articles are intervention pieces, and most of those have some pretty spurious designs, and yet we are an applied profession. So I think a commitment to intervention pieces, and that as JCD editor, that's actually something I do privilege. Like I try to play everything very straight and but intervention pieces, given how the lowest common denominator of an intervention piece is that it's helped provide services to people out there. And more than that, it has the potential to edify all the readers. And so for me, it's like, this is the type of work that we should prioritize. And unfortunately, it is so diminutive in our literature. So I think that's one. But also acknowledging that it is tough, right? When it's incumbent upon you to do the greatest amount of research is when you're a doctoral student or junior faculty member, and intervention research is really hard because it takes as you said before, being out in the community. So it might take a year or two to establish rapport and trust, then to actually deliver the intervention and then it be successful, because unfortunately there is a publication bias towards things that show significance. And so it's risky.
So you got a grant really early on in your career.
Yeah.
That was an example of what we're talking about right now. Can you talk a little bit about that, and where have you taken that? Because I don't think when you left Missouri, I think it left with you, or that at least that template left with you. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, the one that I think you're referring to, there was a couple. So I had one through St. Louis City Public Schools and then another one through Ferguson Florissant, which unfortunately folks probably are very familiar with the name. And yeah, it was related to this work. So my primary work has been on, and actually I want to take a step back in answering this. So your question was so intuitive about language. I do think that our prior belief systems greatly dictate how we pursue activity. And I think when we look at school counseling, most of our, and this is true also for community counseling, most of our belief systems, our theories of practice, are imported from psychology. And those are helpful, but then therefore they're very limited because of our focus on prevention, development, wellness, and then also social justice. If things are so deeply tethered to this idea of anesthetizing psychopathology, and then our interventions are informed as such, how fit are those approaches? And that's not to say that those theories and those different that training that we have has no positive influence, but I do sometimes question the precision of fit. And so for school counseling in particular, because there's a certain ecology of schools, I wanted to create a belief system that was commensurate with what school counselors do, the roles and responsibilities, also the developmental realities of young children. And then how do we have interventions that inform what counselors do on a daily basis? And so, yeah, as a consequence of that work, we've had those grants and many others since then. Thornburg Foundation funded us for a number of years, which is really great work. And fortunately, we've been able to see incredible outcomes on things like changes in executive function, which is basically emotional regulation and goal-focused decision, feelings of connectedness. But what people are really interested in my work has always been, how is these social emotional learning, how is mindfulness affecting academic achievement? Because we're not talking about having kids practice 1+1 anymore. We're talking about how social influences, how internal mental influences determine your experience in a classroom, your experience of your teacher, and so on and so forth. And then more recently, we've been doing some funded work on with teachers, given the amount of stress, particularly in response to COVID, but then some of the other social stressors that we've seen. How can we keep them more engaged in the classroom, more culturally responsive to kids, especially in culturally diverse environments, and then less likely to, leave the profession. So
I love the fact that you don't say I. I don't think I ever really hear you ever say I. You say we a lot. Can you talk about that? Because you carry people with you. I mean, this is your vision sometimes, most of the time, that you're carrying out in terms of the research, but you bring people with you. Can you talk about that?
all right, so I can get really like esoteric and philosophic about it, and I'll do that briefly. But then there's just like the practical relational side. Yeah. So I mean, I believe in the co-regulation of experience. That when we, whether we deconstruct the at a neurobiological level, there is no singular I, right? There's this illusion that I'm making autonomous decisions. I'm always doing this in relationship to other people. Now, more practically and more relationally, I'm not an automaton. I've always collaborated with colleagues like yourself. I've learned from people like yourself, students. I go into every classroom and every counseling situation, and I started off by saying, I'm going to learn more from you all than you will learn from me. And that shared learning is going to be a testament to the influence of this class or this counseling situation. So yeah, it's a very intuitive question. I deeply believe that we are always socially bound together, and therefore any interventions, any scholarship really has to kind of double down on prizing.
Be reflective of it. Be reflective of what you say you bring forth, because I think also that helps people who may not have the wherewithal to think of this along, in the same type of capacity, right? But still want to be supportive, want to be helpful, want to, again, engage in that social justice piece. That brings them along and gives them a portion of the success that you're having with all of this. So what would you say if you were to look at, 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, what would people say was Matthew Lemberger-Truelove's legacy?
Wow. Honestly, what I would hope is that there's a great line from Alfred Adler where he said something along the lines of, though people might forget our work, the impact of our influence will persist many generations, or something of that sort. And so I would truthfully be more interested in knowing that my work has in some way affected schools, affected the children in those schools. And then also, honestly, given my own kids a better life than what I had as a young person, right? So again, it's all socially bound. And in a similar way, my students, it's nice to be recognized. I mean, I'm not exempt of that, but I really do hope that it's the lived experience of people. And then the last thing is, because of my passion for school counseling, I do think that there's something very unique about school counseling, that school counseling is rightly prioritized as an essential ingredient to the mental health profession, as this unique contributor, particularly to preventative based work. So
I'm gonna we get ready to head into a break in a few minutes, and I'm gonna have a little bit of fun with you for a second. I think I was with you, or not with you per se, when you got your first tattoo. If I'm not mistaken, you didn't get your first tattoo until you were a faculty member at University of Missouri St. Louis. I kind of remember you coming into the office with the way that they used to do it back then. I think they used to have people have the Vaseline and the wrap around the arm and all this other stuff. And you were so impressed with that. And the only reason why I'm bringing it up because I saw you move your arm and I saw a tattoo there. And I'm just wondering, because we haven't been together in a minute, is that still the only one, or how many tattoos do you have now?
No, there's quite a few, and really the only reason it was only one at that point is because, as I've suggested, I grew up pretty economically modest, and I just couldn't afford it, and I just did not trust the kid down the street to do the stick and pick, right? And so when I finally got a little bit of a bank account, I was willing to do it for real. But no, there's quite a few more at this point.
I just remember that experience. I remember you being thrilled with it. And I remember because I don't have any, and I was always like, why did you get a tattoo, man?
Yeah.
So now it's blossomed into many more.
Yeah, and they're also, like language, very reflective of ideas. Like my favorite one, other than the ones of like my kids' footprints, is from a great Buddhist, Chan Buddhist quote. What do you do when you see the Buddha walking down the street? You kill him. And while morbid, the idea is that if you're so fixated in someone else's awakeness, you yourself will never pursue it. And so it's a constant reminder of not taking oneself too serious, not getting, especially as a faculty member, given our power and privilege. I don't want to be that authority. I want my students to metaphorically kill me and be their own awakened one. So yeah.
Matthew Lemberger is nothing if he is not deep. So this has been the Voice of Counseling. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back. Thank you, Matthew. We'll be back in a moment.
Counselors help positively impact lives by providing support, wellness, treatment. We're working to change lives. We are creating a world where every person has access to the quality, professional counseling, and mental health services needed to thrive.
Welcome back to the Voice of Counseling. I'm here with Dr. Matthew Lemberger-Truelove, and we've just been talking about the good old days and some of the things that he has going on. Question.
Mm-hmm.
You transitioned after 7 years of being with one journal, the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, over to your new love, the Journal of Counseling and Development. Can you talk a little bit about that transition and what made you move from one that you love to this next one?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important question because in many ways there's more challenges with JCD just given the numbers of submissions, right? And so whereas I could focus with JHC, now in many ways JCD you have to represent all 19 subspecialties, and so I was aware of that when I came in, and so the decision was very intentional. One of which was and kind of informed what I talked about before. Like my work in humanism has a lot to do with challenging old ideas in humanism to include more social justice ideas, also to challenge this idea of this kind of autonomous self making fully responsible decisions. I think that our clients have such complexity, and yet there still is some value in the practice of establishing good relationships. So that's something that's still a core value of mine, but it became really a pragmatic decision because with JHC, though there's a passionate readership, it's relatively limited. Whereas with JCD, it theoretically touches a good critical mass of our scholars and then also readers beyond that. And so I really wanted to have a deeper impact in that way, and not just on the content.
That was part of your vision. Your vision was to kind of take the humanistic side of it and broaden it, because there's a need within JCD to be able to do that.
And especially related to something we talked about before, that the absence of just those kind of robust numbers of intervention pieces, particularly intervention pieces that were targeting individuals in depressed social circumstances. And then there was another practical or kind of editorial, because when I first started doing reviews and then later associate editor and editor, it was just like a service activity towards tenure, but then I didn't realize how much I would love it. And I really do genuinely love it. And so
just backtracking a little bit, you were pretty much like night and day workaholic.
Yeah. I work a lot.
I remember like, let's go do so-and-so. No, you already got tenure. Leave me alone. That type of mentality that you had going into this. So yes, I could see the worker bee in you not being able to let go.
Yeah. And so, and there was also this part of me that was like, with JHC, when something gets rejected, because unfortunately we have to reject many more pieces than we accept.
Right.
It doesn't oftentimes go anywhere else. Whereas with JCD, my thought was, if we're going to reject approximately 90% of pieces, how can I help that process so it's more we-like, right? And so
Mm.
knowing that I not only inform what gets published in JCD, that there's this downstream effect that our suggestions, and so trying to create a culture with my reviewers and my associate editors of not just giving, like toxic feedback, not that I think that they were, but how do we make it so that it's helpful,
Well,
so that it can
you
improve?
can damage someone and
Yeah, you
hurt
really can.
their trajectory in terms of their career
Totally.
just by one review.
And one of my favorite things that I get, I mean, I don't like that, again, that we have to reject so many, but I love it when authors respond back to me and say, that was the most helpful rejection. And so I wanted to also do that, right? I also wanted to say, how can I help amplify a certain way of being a scholar that is more relational and more constructive than what is oftentimes done in academia broadly, right? And so I think we've accomplished that. I'm actually, it's even in some ways become a challenge with JCD because we've created such a culture of that, of being helpful rather than just reactionary and evaluative. Sometimes I feel like I don't even have to offer as much commentary now because my reviewers have kind of gotten into that.
You set the culture up to be able to do that, which is also another social justice piece. So as the editor, you must have a target on your back sometimes. So are there times when you're walking around a conference and you're like, oh my God, I hope I don't run into some people who don't appreciate the feedback?
I did, given COVID, I just don't want them to cough on me. No,
That's
honestly,
not funny. Let me stop. I didn't mean to laugh. Okay.
No,
so,
I mean, but it's
seriously.
Humor, good humor should be by.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, I believe that if you're helpful, even if you feel that someone else's perspective is wrongheaded, there's a great, from the philosopher Daniel Dennett, he used what was called the Rappaport's rules and the ways to help motivate people to other perspectives. The first step in the Rappaport's rules is you have to say things in such a way that the interlocutor to whom you're speaking with would say in response, wow, I wish I would have thought of my own experience that way, right? Like you're so in their perspective. And that's because as human beings, we have this kind of tribal predisposition. And so when I'm reading work, I try to be from the perspective of the author, knowing that they put a lot of time and investment, the stakes are high. And I'm not perfect by any means, but I do think that that comes out. And so, most of the time when I'm at conferences and I'm talking with authors, I get that response of, thank you, that was helpful, right?
Good. That's good. Yeah. I know that like when I work with students, especially those who are working on a dissertation, I have to bring them back to, read a journal or two and see what's happening in there. But also, I need you to write this for somebody who doesn't know what you're talking about. And I think you need to keep that in mind, right? So as you're writing, yes, you know this stuff backwards and forward. But I often said to them, and they look at me like, are you crazy? I said, write it like you're writing it for a fifth grader. And sometimes that helps them kind of put into context that, yes, the people who are reading my things don't know. So I know that as a reviewer, if somebody really maps out what their study was, I'm going to have a much easier time giving them good feedback and seeing that journal through to, or that manuscript through to a publication than someone who is all over the place because they're so busy trying to have this lofty goal of putting the work out there, right? And so the social justice piece of being an editor is so important across the board. So again, it's not to crush anyone's dreams, but it's also to help them become a better writer. And I got that from my mentor who told me from day one, you have to write so that you don't get rejected.
Yeah, and you're kind of alluding to this other thing that I think is important to me as an editor, and that is being attentive to the intersecting identities of who is being studied, how is it being studied, who are the scholars studying it, which also pertains to the social justice ideology, right? Where if we are a profession that is really grounded in helping, again, without, inadvertently kind of reifying this perpetual marginalization of people's identities, knowing that giving people voice and perspective who otherwise are disenfranchised is an important aspect of any journal, especially a helping profession journal.
Yeah, I like that you say that because I think it ties into the fact that research and publications do play a role, right? in helping counselors promote equity and address social justice issues. And so is that one of your mainstays? Is that something that, you have put into the atmosphere in terms of people who are putting in requests to be, I guess, published in your journal?
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I always look for, is the study as a standalone contribution to the literature quality? I mean, that's always got to be foremost. But if that's established, then what differentiates? Because you're going to get, a third of publications are just really, really solid, and will be published in a high quality journal. And if that's the case, I still have to reject the greater majority of those.
Right.
And so then what differentiates those? And for me, do they vivify the spirit of counseling, what makes it a unique profession? And again, that goes back to this idea of prevention, wellness, development, and then the later, which I think was always there. I mean, we actually, as a profession, we're going through the 100th volume celebration this year of JCD, and looking back, I'm very proud that one of our early pieces, like Charles Thompson had an early vocational guidance piece on working with diverse individuals, and so that's in our history. But how do we give life to that through our work? And so if that's in the fiber of a piece, that will be more likely published. Again, of course, given quality of design and quality.
So that must be, you said that you're highlighting the 100th. That must be a fun thing to kind of have on your, I guess, something that you can hang your hat on in terms of your editorship. What's that been like?
I mean, in some ways it's peculiar because it's the way that the profession started and when the journal became, because there were multiple different permutations, right? It wasn't always JCD, it was occupations and so on and so forth. And so the start date doesn't perfectly align with ACA transitioning into a discrete group or unified group, but still it is important, right? Because this number, as human beings, we're deeply influenced by certain like the gestalt of numbers, like ordering of numbers, and 100 just for some reason means something. It's just another number in there, right? We're going to 3 digits. So so that's been really fun. But what's also been fun about it is that it's given me an opportunity. We're going to do a special virtual issue, is going back through our literature and saying, what are some of these kind of bellwether, kind of watershed pieces throughout the history of the journal, and then trying to find, whittle this down to like 15 or so pieces, and which ones do you choose, which authors do you choose, how do you represent time, how do you represent all the subspecialties? So it's been a fun thing, and I'm excited for the association and for the journal to be able to celebrate it.
Cool, that's excellent. So I got a question for you with regards to, so a person writes, they put a lot of due diligence into this. A lot of times people are looking at it and saying, I need this for tenure, I need this, for whatever reasons. But everybody's shooting for JCD, which again shows cases in the number of rejections that you all have to do. Is there an obligation from those who have leadership positions in, counseling spaces like ACA, JCD, to provide other platforms for writers? So like, you can't get into JCD. This piece was really, really good. If you kind of cultivate it, I can see it being something. But as JCD, or has there been conversations at all about how to get those pieces who are just not ready for prime time to still get the light of day?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of pertains to what I was alluding to before, is that I hope that our feedback is not just evaluative in terms of like, how did we decide whether or not this was acceptable or not, but instead it has just enough of that so that the authors can know, here's how the decisions were made. But then moreover, what most of the feedback should be is what can you do to improve this, so that, kind of going into what you had said before, there's some relatively objective person on the other side of your work. Here's how they received it. And this is kind of how I view it as an author. Like, I've received feedback before and I'm like, the reviewer's wrong, right? But
Yes,
but
and you have to understand that too, right? And
yep,
then where to shop it at next, right?
yep,
So that's the thing, right? So don't give up on it, because sometimes people might say, okay, didn't get into JCD, I'm not going to go. Do you all give feedback to them about, hey, this didn't really work for us.
totally,
Maybe you can look at this particular place?
totally, yeah. And we certainly recommend the ACA affiliated specialty journals, and we hope that they publish there, and we hope that the feedback is so helpful in JCD that they also come back to JCD, because I think people, they kind of conflate this idea of like, oh, I was rejected once and therefore my work is not, they internalize it, my work will never be good enough. It's like, no, we want this experience to be so good that that this is just an unfortunate numbers thing in some ways.
Right.
And also sometimes, there is some arbitrariness to it in that, is there a certain topic that is important right now?
Alien right now, yeah.
Or, have we published a lot of these types of things? Or
Which is a history lesson to be learned, right?
yeah,
Because you need to do your homework. If you send in a piece that you saw was in JCD 12 times over the last 5 years, you might want to think about looking somewhere else.
and it goes either way, because in some ways you're like, oh, maybe this editor, it's something that they value, right? On the other
Right.
hand, it's like, well, maybe it's what's that old expression, old wine, new wines through old silk cloths, right?
Yeah.
And so but to this idea, right, we hope that people don't have such trepidation about submitting, and instead that they submit because going in they know that even if this doesn't get accepted, that I'm going to receive such good feedback that it was worth the time.
It was worth
Right.
the time. Okay.
Yep. And
But the
so,
thing is this though, Matthew, how do we also make sure that when people do this work, it just doesn't sit in a journal on a shelf somewhere?
that's a great question, and that's one of the things that has been an important part of my consideration, because there is a scholarship out there about the numbers of times that articles are actually read.
Yeah.
And it's
Yes.
pretty scary, right?
Right.
And how does it actually impact people? But
Mhm.
I take two schools of thought on this. Is one of which is like, how do you improve the accessibility of knowledge, right? The second of which is that maybe we're having a short-sighted perspective, because if it's only read in certain context, is that context generative enough? So, for example, as a
For somebody's
scholar,
career in life.
that's what, and also as a scholar, like
Mhm.
the work that I do to produce scholarship affects my teaching, and affects
Exactly.
my service work. It affects my still the counseling work that I still do to this day. So even though maybe there is a limited readership, if we're really honest about the amount of times that pieces are read, I still think that it reverberates out in other ways. Now, that's true, but I still don't think that should preclude us from coming up with new ways, and like podcasts like this, or um, doing community-based engaged activities, so that research gets distilled out in different ways to different people.
Right, exactly. And it has to, because I mean, what is the good of having all of this knowledge and it's just sitting in a book somewhere, or in a journal somewhere? Because I think that's for me, that's the true social justice piece of the puzzle, right? If I did a great intervention, and you've done some phenomenal interventions, if I did such a great intervention, I shouldn't just have it for the people who were able to engage in it in my study or in the work that I've been doing in my community. There should be, like, you were doing it in Missouri, you were doing it in New Mexico, you're doing it now in North Texas. If it was in all other places because somebody replicated it and did something to showcase that, and maybe again, the nuance of it is that they don't necessarily take it and do it verbatim for what you put forth and what you do. They have to look at their communities and adapt it to those particular spaces. But that, I think, is the beauty of whatever somebody could publish, is that somebody would then take it. I mean, I think that's the reward in publishing, not maybe getting tenure, maybe not getting, moved up the ranks, but somebody was taking the work that you put social justice minded entities into, that they now taking that, and it's being purposed for people in other communities, and hoping in some regards to help the world change.
Yeah, and then one of the questions I know you and I had talked about in advance, that we're just not going to have too much time to elaborate on, but I think that's one of the things that differentiates counseling research from other helping professions.
Okay.
What is considered the gold standard of publications is oftentimes randomized control trials. And honestly, most of my work is randomized control trials because I want people to value counseling, particularly school counseling, in multiple circles. This being said, I do question if that's actually true, because in the replication crisis in developmental psychology has shed some light on this, because there's something unique about work that's being done situated in a naturalistic environment. It makes it more challenging on the one hand, but it's exactly what you suggest, that if we do things that is not highly controlled, because it's in natural settings where counselors are helping individuals, not only does it have a social justice potential outcome for those clients and those counselors, but moreover, it more likely is the gold standard because it's inclusive of what it takes to deliver this type of work, given all the warts and tribulations and difficulties in naturalistic settings. And so, I think it has academic value in that way, but I also think it has just very practical value in that it just touches people in broader circumstances. So, is it as empirically generalizable? Sometimes yes, but oftentimes, if we're honest, not necessarily. But I think that's a virtue.
So one last word from you, sir. What is it that counselors need to know about this publishing of good work? What do they need to know? What words of inspiration would you give them if they're submitting something to JCD?
Yeah, I'll go back to what I alluded to before. The common factors literature is very wise in suggesting the importance of relationships, quality relationships. This is, I think, at the core of how you develop as an individual and at the core of how social justice is embodied and expressed. If your work is influenced by quality relationships, it's going to have a place in JCD.
That's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew Lemberger-Truelove. I really appreciate you and the work that you've been doing. I am so proud of you and everything that you set out to do. You're continuing to set the tone and the mark so that people can kind of continue to move forward. And not only I see in you that you want it to not just be left at your level, you want to see it expand and go beyond. So that's what social justice is really all about, right? Is that you take what I've been able to do and take it to the next level. And so I appreciate you. Thank you for being a guest today on the Voice of Counseling from the American Counseling Association. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, my friend.